Adrian Voss called the same number 4 times in a row, and 4 times it rang out into silence. Daniel Cross never missed a call, not once in 6 years. Adrian set the phone down on the glass table and looked at it the way a man looks at a problem he cannot solve with money or with fear, which were the only 2 tools he had ever needed before. In 2 days, the most important meeting of his career would take place in a conference room 20 floors above the city, and the one person who made that meeting possible had vanished without a word. Adrian ran an import company that moved goods through the port faster and cheaper than anyone else in the region. On paper, it was shipping containers and customs paperwork. Underneath that paper was a second business, quieter and far more profitable, one that required trust between men who did not always speak the same language. For 6 years, Daniel Cross had been the bridge between Adrian's Russian and the careful English needed to close deals worth millions of dollars. Adrian spoke English well enough to order dinner, well enough to charm a room when nothing important was at stake, but the moment numbers and promises and warnings needed to be exact, his English thinned out, and small mistakes in meaning could end careers, or worse. Marcus Doyle stood near the window with his arms crossed, watching his boss pace the length of the office for the better part of an hour. Marcus had been at Adrian's side longer than Daniel had, longer than anyone currently working for the company. He was the kind of man people described as solid, dependable, the one who handled problems quietly, so Adrian never had to ask twice. "He's not answering his phone," Adrian said, more to himself than to Marcus. "He's not answering the office line. His apartment is empty." "People disappear for all kinds of reasons," Marcus said. "Maybe he got scared off. Maybe he found a better offer somewhere else." "Daniel does not get scared," Adrian said, "and nobody pays him what I pay him." Marcus shrugged, the kind of shrug that ends a conversation rather than continuing it, and said he would ask around. Adrian barely heard him. His mind had already moved to Thursday, to the meeting with Edward Lang and Olivia Grant, 2 of the most careful business partners he had ever worked with. They had flown in from out of state twice already, and twice the deal had stalled over details that needed to be perfect in both languages. A third stall would not be forgiven. Men like Edward Lang did not give third chances. They simply found someone else to do business with and made sure word got around about why. Adrian spent the rest of that day making calls that led nowhere. He sent 2 of his men to check hospitals, train stations, anywhere a person might end up if something had gone wrong rather than simply walking away. Nothing came back. By evening, the silence from Daniel Cross had become its own kind of message, one that worried Adrian more than any threat could have. He was still in his office near 9 that night, staring at a contract written in English he only partly trusted himself to understand, when someone knocked at his door, not the main door downstairs, where his security checked every visitor twice. This was the side door near the private elevator, the one almost nobody used. Adrian opened it expecting trouble. Instead, he found a young woman standing there with a paper delivery bag in one hand and her phone in the other, frowning at the screen like it had personally wronged her. "I am so sorry," she said quickly, looking up at him. "The app sent me to the wrong floor. Again. This building hates me." She held up the bag as if it explained everything. Adrian stared at her for a moment, caught somewhere between annoyance and the strange relief of a normal, ordinary problem after a day of nothing but bad news. "This is not a restaurant," he said. "I know that now," she said, already typing something into her phone, switching without pausing into another language entirely, muttering under her breath as she texted whoever ran the delivery service, telling them the address was wrong for the 2nd time that week. The words came out smooth and fast, completely different from the English she had just used with him, and just as natural. Adrian's eyes narrowed. He understood every word. She was speaking Russian. Not the careful textbook kind people picked up from a class, but the real thing, full of small habits and rhythms that only come from hearing a language spoken at home, every day, by someone who loved you enough to argue with you in it. "You speak Russian," Adrian said. She looked up, surprised that he had heard her at all. "My grandmother raised me. She refused to speak English in the house, even after 40 years here. I used to think it was the most annoying thing in the world." She smiled, a little embarrassed. "Sorry, I should not be standing here talking. Wrong floor. I will go now." "Wait," Adrian said. She paused, one hand already on the elevator button, the bag of food slowly losing its warmth between them. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, doing the kind of fast calculation he was used to doing with money and risk, Except this time the question in his head had nothing to do with either. "What is your name?" he asked. "Grace," she said. "Grace Bennett. Why?" Adrian did not answer right away. He was thinking about Thursday, about Edward Lang and Olivia Grant sitting across the table from him with nothing standing between his Russian and their English, except whatever he could manage on his own, which was not enough, not for a deal this size. "I have a job for you," he said. "It pays better than delivering food." Grace laughed, the short, polite laugh people give when they assume someone is joking. When Adrian did not laugh back, her smile faded into something more careful. "I don't know what kind of job you mean," she said, "but I should probably go." "One afternoon," Adrian said. 2 hours, maybe 3. "I need someone who can translate for a meeting. That is all. You would be paid for your time, generously. And then you can go back to your deliveries and forget this ever happened." Grace glanced past him into the office, taking in the city lights through the windows, the kind of space that cost more in a month than she made in a year. She had grown up around enough hard truths to recognize that this offer, however simple it sounded, was not actually simple at all. Men who needed translators for important meetings, men who lived behind private elevators and unlisted addresses, were rarely men with ordinary problems. "I have a job already," she said carefully. "I am not asking you to quit it," Adrian said. "I am asking for one afternoon." She should have said no. Later, she would think back to this exact moment and wonder why she hadn't, why the offer of easy money had been enough to quiet the part of her brain that knew better. The truth, when she was honest with herself, was simpler than she wanted it to be. Rent was due in 9 days. Her car needed a repair she had been putting off for a month. And there was something about the way this man asked, like the request cost him something just to say out loud, that made her curious in a way she didn't fully understand. "How generous is generous?" she asked. Adrian named a number. It was more than she made in 2 weeks of deliveries combined. "One afternoon," she repeated, mostly to herself, as if saying it again would make it sound less reckless. "One afternoon," Adrian agreed. She should have asked more questions. What kind of business? What kind of meeting? Why a man with an office like this one needed a stranger off the street instead of someone from an agency? Someone with a name on a business card and a contract that protected them both. But the bag of orange chicken was getting cold in her hand. Her shift technically wasn't over. And somewhere underneath all of her good sense was a smaller, quieter voice that whispered this might be the start of something, even if she couldn't yet say what. "Fine," she said. "One afternoon. But I want it in writing, and I want half up front." For the first time since she had arrived at his door, Adrian looked something close to amused. "Done," he said. Grace left the building 20 minutes later with a business card in her pocket and a knot in her stomach that she chose to ignore. She told herself it was nothing. A strange evening, a strange man, a job that would be over before she had time to think too hard about it. She had no way of knowing that Daniel Cross's silence was not the end of a small mystery, but the opening of a much larger and more dangerous one, and that by walking through that side door with the wrong order in her hand, she had just stepped into the middle of it. 2 days passed in a blur of ordinary life that felt strangely loud against the memory of that office. Grace went to work. She delivered food to apartments that smelled like other people's dinners, made small talk with doormen, and tried not to think too much about the meeting that was coming. She told herself it was just a job, translation for a business meeting. People did this kind of work every day, for lawyers and doctors and immigrants navigating systems that were never built with them in mind. There was nothing strange about it, she told herself, even as some part of her refused to fully believe it. On the morning of the meeting, a car arrived outside her apartment building exactly on time, sent by Adrian's office, driven by a quiet man who did not make conversation. Grace sat in the back seat in the only blazer she owned, feeling like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life, and watched the city slide past the window until the car pulled up outside the same building she had wandered into by accident 2 nights before. This time she was let in through the front entrance. Security checked her name against a list. She was given a visitor badge and led upstairs by a young assistant who barely looked at her, clearly used to important people passing through, and unimpressed by anyone who didn't fit that description. Adrian was waiting in a different room this time, a long conference space with a view of the harbor, the kind of room built to make people feel small and impressed at the same time. He looked different in daylight, more composed, his suit perfectly pressed, his expression unreadable. "You came," he said, as if there had been real doubt about it. "I said I would," Grace replied, "though I still don't fully understand what I'm doing here." "You are here to make sure two languages say the same thing," Adrian said. "That is all you need to understand." Before she could ask anything else, the door opened, and two people walked in who clearly belonged to a different world than either Grace or the quiet men stationed along the walls. Edward Lang was tall, gray at the temples, dressed in a suit that looked tailored rather than bought off a rack. Beside him, Olivia Grant carried a leather folder under one arm and the kind of calm, assessing expression that made Grace immediately straighten her posture without meaning to. "Mr. Voss," Edward said, shaking Adrian's hand with the brisk efficiency of someone who valued time above almost everything else. "I hope this is the last time we have to do this dance." "As do I," Adrian said, his English careful and slightly stiff. "This is Grace. She will help us speak clearly today." Edward glanced at Grace with mild curiosity, the kind reserved for an unexpected detail in an otherwise familiar routine. "Where's the usual fellow? Daniel, was it?" "Unavailable," Adrian said smoothly, the lie sitting easily on his tongue. "Grace is more than capable." Grace felt the weight of 4 sets of eyes turn toward her at once, and resisted the urge to smooth down her blazer again. She had translated for her parents her whole childhood, doctor's appointments and parent-teacher conferences and arguments with insurance companies, but never anything like this. Never a room where the wrong word might cost someone millions of dollars instead of an afternoon of frustration. They sat. The meeting began. For the first 10 minutes it went well enough. Edward spoke in long, careful sentences about shipping volumes and timelines, and Grace translated them into Russian for Adrian, who responded just as carefully, his words moving back through Grace and into English for the two Americans across the table. It felt almost mechanical, like she was simply a wire carrying a current from one side of the room to the other, and Grace started to relax into the rhythm of it. Then Olivia Grant leaned forward and said something that made the temperature of the room shift. "Before we go further," Olivia said, her tone pleasant but pointed, "we'd like an explanation for why our last shipment arrived 2 containers short. Mr. Voss assured us that wouldn't happen again." Grace translated it exactly as it was said. Adrian's jaw tightened, and his answer in Russian came out fast, sharp, and full of words that, if translated directly, would have sounded less like an explanation and more like an accusation thrown back across the table. Grace hesitated. She understood every word Adrian had said. She also understood, with sudden clarity, that repeating those words exactly as spoken would end this meeting in the next 30 seconds, and probably end the deal along with it. Daniel Cross had spent 6 years learning not just 2 languages, but the space between them, the place where a sentence could be true, and also softened, accurate, and also strategic. Grace took a breath and chose her words carefully. "Mr. Voss says the shortage was a documentation error on the dock side, not a missing shipment," she said in English. "He's already corrected the process and would like to walk you through the new tracking system, if that would help." It wasn't exactly what Adrian had said. It was, however, close enough to true, and far more useful than the truth delivered without any softening at all. Across the table, Olivia's expression eased slightly. Edward nodded, satisfied for the moment. Adrian glanced at Grace, just briefly, his expression giving nothing away, but she saw it, the small flicker of recognition, the understanding that she had just done something far more valuable than simple translation. She had protected the room from itself. The meeting continued for another hour, tense in places, smooth in others, and by the end of it, Edward Lang stood and shook Adrian's hand again, this time with something that looked almost like genuine warmth. "We'll be in touch about finalizing the paperwork," Edward said. "Good to have someone reliable handling the details." He glanced at Grace as he said it, and she understood, with a strange mix of pride and unease, that he meant her. When the Americans had gone, Adrian sat back down at the head of the table and looked at Grace for a long moment without speaking. The room felt suddenly much quieter than it had all afternoon. "You changed what I said," he told her finally. It wasn't an accusation. It sounded more like a question he was still working out the answer to himself. "You said something that would have made them walk out of here angry," Grace said. "I said something that would not. The meaning was the same. The delivery was different." Adrian studied her with an expression she couldn't quite place, somewhere between surprise and something closer to respect. "Daniel never did that," he said. He translated my words exactly. Every time. Maybe that's why you're still missing him, Grace said, then immediately wished she could take it back, the words slipping out faster than she meant to let them. Adrian's face changed, just slightly, something tightening behind his eyes. What do you mean by that? Nothing, Grace said quickly. I just meant, maybe exact words aren't always what a room needs. That's all I meant. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the windows, the harbor stretched out gray and quiet under a sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain. Grace was aware, suddenly and completely, of how far she was from the world she understood, the world of delivery apps and apartment buzzers and ordinary, forgettable days. The afternoon is over, Adrian said finally, his voice returning to its earlier businesslike tone. You did well. You will be paid as agreed. Grace nodded and stood, gathering her things, telling herself this was the end of it, exactly as they had agreed. One afternoon, nothing more. She was almost at the door when Adrian spoke again. Grace. She turned. There may be more meetings, he said, if you are interested. She should have said no. She thought about Daniel Cross, a name she had heard only once, in passing, and the strange, careful way Adrian's face had changed when she mentioned him. She thought about the kind of business that required a translator who could soften threats into explanations, and the kind of building that needed a side door, and a private elevator, and security checking names against a list. I'll think about it, she said, which was not quite a no, and not quite a yes either. She left the building that afternoon with more money in her account than she had seen in months, and a feeling in her chest that she couldn't fully name, somewhere between excitement and the distinct, uncomfortable sense that she had just stepped onto a path with no clearly marked way back. Grace told herself for 3 straight days that she would not call the number on the business card sitting on her kitchen counter. She told herself this while she worked her usual shifts, while she paid the rent that had been due, while she finally got her car repaired with money that had come from a single afternoon of work, instead of 2 weeks of deliveries. The card stayed on the counter, face up, like a small dare she kept losing. On the 4th day, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Grace Bennett, said a voice she now knew belonged to Adrian Voss. I have another meeting, Thursday, same arrangement. I never said yes to a second one, Grace said, though she was already reaching for a pen to write down the time. You also never said no, Adrian replied, and there was something almost like humor in his voice, dry and brief, gone as quickly as it appeared. Thursday, 10 in the morning. She agreed before she had fully decided to, and hung up the phone feeling the same mixture of excitement and unease she had felt walking out of his building the first time. She told herself this was simply a side job, a way to make extra money translating for a businessman who happened to deal in shipping. She did not let herself think too hard about the side door, or the private elevator, or the careful way Adrian had reacted to the name Daniel Cross. The second meeting went the way the first one had, tense in places, smooth in others, with Grace learning quickly how to read the room, how to catch the moment a sentence needed softening before it left her mouth. Edward Lang and Olivia Grant seemed more at ease this time, treating Grace less like an unknown variable and more like a fixture, someone whose presence made the whole process easier rather than harder. After the meeting, as Grace was gathering her things, Olivia approached her at the edge of the room, lowering her voice slightly. You're good at this, Olivia said. Better than the last one, honestly, though I probably shouldn't say that. Grace's curiosity sharpened immediately, the careful kind of curiosity she had learned to keep hidden behind a polite expression. The last one? Daniel, Olivia said. He was precise, but stiff. Everything came out exactly as it was meant, which isn't always a good thing in a negotiation. She paused, glancing toward the door where Adrian stood speaking quietly with one of his men. He stopped coming to meetings a few weeks ago. We assumed Mr. Voss let him go. Did you ever ask why? Grace said, keeping her tone light, casual, the way she might ask about the weather. Olivia shrugged. Not really our business. People come and go in this line of work. She smiled, polite but final, the kind of smile that closed a subject rather than opening it further, and excused herself to join Edward by the door. Grace stood there a moment longer than she needed to, turning the word over in her mind. Let go. That was one explanation. It was not, she suspected, the only one. Over the following 2 weeks, the meetings became more frequent, and Grace's role grew alongside them. She was no longer just a presence in the conference room. She began sitting in on smaller conversations, phone calls between Adrian and contacts whose names she was never given, brief exchanges in hallways where Adrian needed a quick translation and trusted her enough by now not to ask twice. She told herself each time that this would be the last new layer, the final step before she pulled back and returned to her normal life. Each time, she found a reason to stay a little longer. Part of it was the money, which had become impossible to ignore. Part of it, if she was honest with herself in the quiet moments before sleep, was something else entirely. Adrian Voss was not an easy man to read, but she had started to notice the small things, the way his shoulders dropped half an inch when a meeting ended well, the way his English loosened slightly when he was tired, slipping into rhythms that sounded almost vulnerable compared to the careful, controlled version he presented to the world. She told herself this noticing meant nothing. She was not entirely convinced. It was on a Tuesday evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, that Grace found herself alone in Adrian's office waiting for him to finish a call in the next room. She had been asked to wait, told it would only be a few minutes, and those few minutes stretched into nearly 20. Restless, she let her eyes wander over the bookshelves, the framed photographs of ports and ships, the heavy wooden desk with its neat stacks of paper. One folder sat slightly apart from the others, its edge sticking out from beneath a stack of shipping manifests, as if it had been hidden in a hurry rather than filed properly. Grace knew, with absolute certainty, that she should not touch it. She also found her hand moving toward it before her better judgment could catch up. Inside was a single page, a list of numbers and dates that meant little to her at first glance, until she saw a name near the bottom that made her stomach drop. Daniel Cross. Beside his name was a dollar figure, larger than anything else on the page, and a date that lined up almost exactly with the week Olivia had mentioned, the week the translator had stopped showing up to meetings. Next to the date was a single word, written in handwriting that was not Adrian's, small and slanted, and oddly careless for something so important. The word was settled. Grace stared at the page for a long moment, her mind racing through explanations that all sounded less convincing the longer she considered them. A settlement could mean a severance payment, a final paycheck for services no longer needed. It could also mean something far less innocent, something that explained why a man who never missed a call had gone silent without a trace, and why his name made Adrian's expression change every time it came up. She heard footsteps approaching the door and shoved the folder back beneath the stack of papers exactly as she had found it, her heart pounding hard enough that she was sure it could be heard across the room. By the time Adrian walked in, she was standing near the window, looking out at the harbor with an expression she hoped looked bored rather than terrified. "Sorry for the wait," Adrian said, dropping into the chair behind his desk. "A problem at the dock. Nothing important." "It's fine," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I wasn't in a hurry." Adrian studied her for a moment longer than necessary, and Grace wondered, with a flicker of panic, whether something in her face had given her away. But he simply nodded, picked up the stack of papers on his desk, the one with the hidden folder beneath it, and slid it into a drawer without comment. "There is a shipment arriving Friday that needs careful handling," he said, switching easily back into business. "I will need you there." "Of course," Grace said, and the word came out smooth and easy, even as her mind kept circling back to a single word, written in someone else's handwriting. Settled. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake, turning the page over in her memory, trying to convince herself she had misread it, that the dollar figure meant exactly what it should mean, and nothing more. But the careful way Adrian's men had searched for Daniel in the first days after his disappearance, checking hospitals and train stations, did not match the simple explanation of a man who had been paid off and sent on his way. People who left quietly and willingly did not require search parties. By morning, Grace had decided on two things. She would keep doing the work, because walking away now, with whatever she now knew, felt more dangerous than staying close enough to understand it fully, and she would watch, carefully, quietly, the way she had learned to watch rooms full of people speaking two languages at once, looking for the gap between what was said and what was actually meant. She started paying closer attention to Marcus Doyle. It was a small thing at first, barely a thought worth noticing. Marcus was always near Adrian, always calm, always the one who handled problems before they became visible. But Grace began noticing the way his eyes moved when Daniel's name came up in passing conversation, the careful blankness of his expression, too smooth to be entirely natural. She noticed, too, that Marcus had access to nearly every part of Adrian's business, the kind of trust built over years, that made him the last person anyone would think to suspect. She told herself this was nothing more than suspicion built on a single overheard word and a folder she shouldn't have opened. She told herself this several times over the following days, each time with less conviction than before. The Friday shipment arrived without incident, a long, tense morning at the docks that ended in handshakes and relief on every side. Adrian seemed lighter afterward, almost relaxed in a way Grace hadn't seen from him before, and he suggested, somewhat abruptly, that they get dinner to celebrate the successful delivery. Grace knew she should say no. She found herself saying yes instead. The restaurant Adrian chose was small and quiet, tucked away on a side street far from the kind of attention his usual world seemed to attract. Over a meal Grace barely tasted, distracted by everything she now knew and couldn't say. Adrian talked more openly than she had heard him talk before, about his childhood in Russia, about the long, difficult journey that had brought him to this country with nothing but a willingness to work harder than anyone willing to stop him. "You remind me of someone," he said at one point, studying her across the table with an expression she couldn't quite place. "Who?" Grace asked. "No one," Adrian said, the subject closing as quickly as it had opened, though something in his voice suggested the answer mattered more than he wanted to admit. Grace thought of the folder hidden beneath the stack of papers, the single word written in handwriting that was not his, and wondered, with a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air, whether the someone he meant was Daniel Cross, and whether the resemblance Adrian saw in her had anything to do with the reason Daniel was no longer there to see it for himself. She did not ask. Some questions, she had learned quickly in this new and dangerous world, were more dangerous to ask than to leave alone. But she carried the question with her all the same, a small, sharp weight settling somewhere beneath her ribs, impossible to set down, and impossible, now, to ignore. On a Saturday morning when she had no meetings scheduled and no real excuse for what she was about to do, Grace found herself standing across the street from an apartment building 3 neighborhoods from her own, the address pulled from a piece of mail she had noticed, half buried, in the recycling bin outside Adrian's office. She told herself she was simply curious. She did not entirely believe that either, not by this point. The building was the kind that had once been nice and was now simply tired, its brick front softened by decades of weather, its lobby door propped open with a folded magazine because the buzzer system had stopped working months earlier, and nobody had gotten around to fixing it. Grace stood at the mailboxes in the entryway, scanning the small printed names until she found the one she was looking for, the metal slot still labeled D, Cross in handwriting gone. An older woman came down the stairs as Grace was still standing there, a small dog tugging at its leash toward the door, and gave her the particular look that longtime residents give to anyone lingering somewhere they don't obviously belong. "Can I help you with something?" the woman asked, not unkindly, simply careful. "I'm trying to find a man who used to live here," Grace said, deciding quickly that the truth, or close enough to it, would serve her better than a lie she hadn't prepared. "Daniel Cross, apartment 4. The woman's expression shifted, something wary moving behind her eyes. "Haven't seen him in weeks. Left in a hurry, from what I could tell. 2 men came around asking after him not long before that, and he seemed different after that. Jumpy, like he was waiting for something bad to happen." "Do you know what they wanted?" Grace asked. "No idea," the woman said. "Wasn't my business to ask, but I'll tell you this. The night he left, he didn't pack like a man moving on with his life. He packed like a man running from one." She tugged gently at the dog's leash, already moving toward the door. "If you find him, tell him Mrs. Patterson upstairs hopes he's somewhere safe." Grace thanked her and stood alone in the quiet lobby for a long moment after the woman had gone, turning the new information over, alongside everything else she already carried. 2 men, asking questions, before Daniel disappeared. A man packing like someone fleeing rather than relocating. It did not match the careless word written beside his name in Adrian's hidden folder. It matched, instead, the much more frightening possibility that someone had wanted Daniel gone badly enough to come looking for him in person, and that he had understood, faster than anyone else around him, exactly how much danger that visit represented. She walked the 6 blocks back to the train station, turning the pieces over in her mind, no closer to certainty than she had been that morning, but carrying now a clearer, colder shape to her fear, one with a face she had started, despite every instinct telling her not to suspect she already knew. 3 weeks into the arrangement, Grace had stopped pretending, even to herself, that this was simply a side job she could walk away from whenever she pleased. She had a keycard to the building now, a desk near Adrian's office that she used more often than not, and a growing sense that she had become something closer to a fixture in his world than a freelancer passing through it. Her old life, the deliveries, the long shifts, the small apartment with the leaking faucet she never had time to fix, had started to feel like a costume she put on for a few hours a week, rather than the life she actually lived. She had not stopped watching Marcus Doyle. It had become a quiet habit, almost involuntary, the way her eyes tracked him whenever he entered a room, the way she noted who he spoke to and for how long, the small, careful distance he kept whenever Adrian mentioned anything related to the missing translator. She had no proof of anything, only a folder she shouldn't have seen, and a feeling she couldn't shake. But feelings, she had learned from years of reading rooms full of people speaking past each other, were rarely entirely wrong. The trouble was, she had no idea what to do with what she suspected. Telling Adrian outright meant explaining how she had come to suspect it in the first place, which meant admitting she had gone through his private papers, which meant risking the fragile trust that had grown between them over the past 3 weeks. And if she was wrong, if Marcus really was simply the loyal second-in-command everyone believed him to be, she would have thrown away that trust for nothing. So she waited, and she watched, and she told herself she would find a way to be certain before she said anything at all. The opportunity came on a Wednesday afternoon, almost by accident. Adrian had stepped out to take a call from Edward Lang, leaving Grace alone in the small office she had been given near his, with instructions to review a set of shipping documents that needed translation before the next meeting. She worked through them steadily, the kind of focused, repetitive task that let her mind wander even as her hands kept moving, until she heard voices through the thin wall separating her office from the hallway. Marcus was speaking, his voice low, careful, the tone of a man who believed he was not being overheard. Grace froze, her pen hovering above the page, and listened without meaning to. "The next shipment needs to go through the usual channel," Marcus was saying. "Voss doesn't need to know the details. He trusts me with the logistics." There was a pause, the sound of a second voice too quiet for Grace to make out clearly, a phone call rather than a conversation between two people in the room. Marcus's voice came again, sharper this time. "I handled the last problem the same way. No one asked questions then, and no one will ask questions now. Just make sure the timing lines up with the Lang meeting. I want their attention somewhere else when it happens." Grace sat perfectly still, barely breathing, her pen still frozen above the page in front of her. The last problem. The words settled into her chest with the same cold weight as the words she had read in that folder weeks earlier. Settled. She thought of Daniel Cross, gone without a trace, and wondered, with a fear that felt suddenly very real and very close, whether she was sitting 20 feet away from the man responsible for it. The voices moved further down the hallway, and Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking slightly as she set down her pen, and she spent a long moment simply staring at the wall, trying to decide what, exactly, she had just heard, and what she was supposed to do about it. She did not get the chance to decide before Adrian returned, his expression tight in a way that immediately pulled her attention away from Marcus and toward whatever new problem had just landed on his desk. "Lang is getting impatient," Adrian said, dropping into the chair across from her without his usual composure. "He wants the final paperwork signed by the end of the month, or he walks. After everything, after 3 meetings and a shipment that finally went right, he wants to walk over a deadline." "Can you meet it?" Grace asked, setting aside, for the moment, everything she had just overheard. "I can meet it if nothing else goes wrong," Adrian said, rubbing a hand over his face, the gesture of a man who had not slept enough in longer than he wanted to admit, which, lately, feels like asking for more than I should expect. Grace hesitated, the conversation she had just overheard pressing against the inside of her chest, demanding to be said out loud. She thought of Marcus's voice, low and certain, talking about timing and attention, and the Lang meeting, and the cold, careful way he had said no one will ask questions now, just as no one had asked them before. "Adrian," she said slowly, "can I ask you something, and you actually answer me honestly?" He looked up, something in his expression shifting, wary in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "You can ask. What really happened to Daniel Cross?" The question landed in the room like something physical, heavy enough to change the air between them. Adrian's jaw tightened. and for a long moment he said nothing at all, his eyes fixed on some point past her shoulder, somewhere in the middle distance where difficult truths apparently lived. "I don't know," he said finally, and his voice had lost its usual careful control, sounding rougher, more honest than she had heard it before. He stopped answering his phone. "I sent men to look for him. They found nothing. No body. No note. Nothing." He looked at her directly now, his eyes searching her face for something she couldn't quite name. "Why are you asking me this?" Grace weighed the risk of telling him everything against the risk of telling him nothing, and found, in the end, that she could not sit across from him and continue pretending she didn't know what she knew. "I found something," she said. "A folder, on your desk, weeks ago. I shouldn't have looked at it, but I did. There was a payment listed next to Daniel's name, a large one, and a word written next to it that wasn't in your handwriting." "What word?" Adrian asked, his voice very quiet now. "Settled," Grace said. Adrian's expression went through several changes in quick succession, confusion sliding into something colder, harder, the look of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the people closest to him. "I never wrote that," he said. "I never authorized any payment to Daniel. I have been looking for him for weeks, paying men to search for him, and there is a folder on my own desk telling me he was paid off and settled, and I never saw it." "Someone put it there for you to find," Grace said, the pieces falling into place even as she spoke them out loud. "Or someone put it there and hoped you wouldn't find it at all and forgot, until I went looking through your desk by accident." Adrian stood abruptly, crossing to the door and closing it fully, a gesture that made the room feel suddenly much smaller and much more serious than it had a moment before. "Who else has access to that desk?" he said. It wasn't really a question. Grace thought of Marcus's voice through the thin wall, low and certain, talking about logistics and timing, and a problem that had already been handled once before. She thought of the careful, practiced blankness in his expression every time Daniel's name came up, the kind of composure that took real effort to maintain. "I think you already know," she said quietly. Adrian was silent for a long moment, his hands braced against the edge of his desk, his shoulders rigid with the kind of stillness that comes right before something breaks. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled in a way that frightened Grace more than shouting would have. "Marcus has worked for me for 9 years," he said. "He has been at my side through everything. If you are wrong about this, you are accusing the one person I trust most in this building." "I'm not accusing anyone," Grace said carefully. "I'm telling you what I saw, and what I heard, and letting you decide what it means. I overheard him on the phone an hour ago. He said he handled the last problem a certain way, and no one asked questions, and he intends to handle the next one the same way, timed around the Lang meeting, so your attention is somewhere else when it happens." Adrian's face had gone very still, the careful composure of a man absorbing information he could not yet afford to react to openly. "What problem?" he said. "What is happening at the Lang meeting?" "I don't know," Grace admitted. "I only heard part of it." Adrian looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted again, softer now, though no less serious. "You did not have to tell me this," he said. "You could have stayed quiet. It would have been safer for you." "I know," Grace said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about the easy answer, the one about loyalty to the work, to the money, to the careful professional distance she had tried to maintain since that first accidental knock on his door. But the truth, when she let herself acknowledge it, was simpler and more complicated than any of that. "Because I'm in this now," she said, "whether I meant to be or not, and I would rather know the truth and be afraid of it than not know, and be comfortable." Adrian studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and for the first time since she had met him, Grace saw something in his expression that looked less like the careful control of a businessman, and more like the plain, unguarded face of a man who had been alone with his suspicions for far too long, grateful, despite everything, not to be alone with them any longer. "We say nothing to him yet," Adrian said finally, his voice low and decisive. "If he believes we suspect nothing, he will make a mistake, and when he does, we will be ready for it." "And if he doesn't make a mistake?" Grace asked. "If he's careful? Then we will need to be more careful than he is," Adrian said. "Starting now." Grace nodded, though the knot in her stomach had not loosened at all. Outside the window, the harbor lights had begun to come on against the darkening sky, ordinary and indifferent to the quiet, dangerous decision being made in the room above it. She thought of Daniel Cross, wherever he was, and hoped, without much real confidence, that the truth they uncovered would not end the same way his story apparently had. That night, unable to sit alone with everything she had learned, Grace called her closest friend from her old delivery route, a woman named Holly who waited tables 2 buildings down from Grace's old apartment and had spent the past month teasing her gently about the mysterious new job that had pulled her out of their usual Friday plans. "You've barely told me anything about this translation thing," Holly said, settling onto Grace's couch with 2 mugs of tea, and the particular look of a friend who has decided the silence has gone on long enough. "Is the money really that good, or is there something else going on I should be worried about?" Grace considered for a moment, telling her everything: the folder, the word written in handwriting that wasn't Adrian's, the slow, creeping suspicion that had attached itself to Marcus Doyle's name. She wanted, badly, to say it all out loud to someone who had nothing to do with any of it, someone whose only stake in the conversation was Grace's own safety. "It's complicated," she said instead. "The man I work for is good to me, but there are things happening around the edges of it that I don't fully understand yet, and I'm trying to be careful." "Careful like watch your wallet careful, or careful like watch your back careful?" Holly asked, only half joking. "Honestly," Grace said, "I'm not entirely sure yet." Holly studied her for a long moment, the playful edge dropping out of her expression. "You know you can walk away from anything, right? Whatever this is, there's no job worth more than you staying safe." "I know," Grace said, and meant it. Even as some quiet, stubborn part of her understood, she had already decided not to walk away. Not yet. Not while there were still answers she felt responsible for finding. She did not tell Holly about Marcus, or the docs, or the words settled written in a stranger's hand. She told her enough to feel less alone with it, and let the rest stay where it was safest, locked carefully behind the same instinct that had once kept her quiet through years of translating other people's hardest conversations. When Holly finally left that night, hugging her a little longer than usual at the door, Grace sat by herself in the quiet apartment and allowed, for the first time in weeks, the full weight of her own fear to settle over her without anyone watching. It passed, eventually, the way it always did, but it left behind a clearer understanding than she had let herself admit until that moment, that whatever came next would ask more of her than translation ever had, and that she had already chosen, somewhere along the way, to give it. The days that followed moved with a strange, careful tension neither of them spoke about openly. Marcus continued his routine exactly as before, calm and competent, and seemingly unaware that he was now being watched as closely as he had once watched everyone else. Adrian grew quieter in meetings, more deliberate, the kind of stillness that Grace recognized now as a man choosing his moments rather than reacting to them. She found herself staying later at the office than she needed to, not entirely for the work anymore. There were evenings when Adrian would talk, briefly and without his usual guardedness, about the years before the company, before the money, when he had been a teenager standing on a dock in a country he barely remembered now, terrified and certain he would either succeed completely or fail in a way there was no coming back from. Grace listened and found herself sharing pieces of her own life in return, her grandmother's stubborn refusal to speak English, the long string of jobs that had never quite added up to the future she had once imagined for herself. It would have been easy, in those quiet moments, to forget the danger sitting just beneath the surface of every ordinary conversation. Grace did not let herself forget it, but she also could not deny, lying awake some nights turning the day over in her mind, that something had shifted between them. Something that had nothing to do with translation, or shipping deals, or the careful professional distance she had promised herself she would maintain. The Lang meeting was now 8 days away. Whatever Marcus was planning, whatever the timing meant, the clock was already running, and Grace understood, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her chest, that whatever happened next would not give either of them much warning before it arrived. The break came, not from careful planning, but from an ordinary mistake, the kind that brings down men who believe themselves too smart to make one. Grace was in the small kitchen off the main office on a Friday afternoon, refilling her coffee, when she overheard Marcus on the phone in the hallway, his voice low, but not quite low enough. She had grown so used to listening for his name, his voice, the particular rhythm of his speech, that her ears caught the conversation almost before her mind registered what she was hearing. "The shipment moves through the South Dock at midnight," Marcus was saying. "Not the usual route. I need it quiet, No one from Voss's regular crew anywhere near it. A pause, then sharper. I don't care what he thinks the schedule is. I am the one who set the real schedule. Just be there. Grace set down her coffee cup without making a sound, and stepped back from the doorway, her heart suddenly loud in her own ears. The South Dock, midnight, a schedule different from the one Adrian believed was happening. She did not know exactly what it meant, but she understood enough to know it mattered, and that whatever Marcus was arranging, he intended for Adrian to know nothing about it until it was already finished. She found Adrian in his office 20 minutes later, and told him everything she had heard, word for word, watching his expression harden with each detail. The South Dock has no scheduled shipment tonight, Adrian said, already reaching for his phone. Nothing of mine is supposed to move through there until next week. Then what is he moving? Grace asked. I don't know, Adrian said, but I intend to find out. He made calls, quiet and urgent, to men Grace had never met, asking questions in clipped Russian that she understood without needing translation for once. Asking about the South Dock, about unscheduled shipments, about anyone who might have seen activity there in the past several days. The answers, when they came, were not reassuring. A container had been logged through an old, rarely used entry point 3 times in the past 2 weeks, each time under paperwork that traced back, eventually and carefully, to Marcus Doyle. He's been running something on the side, Adrian said, his voice tight with a controlled fury that Grace had not heard from him before. Using my docks, my crews, my name for something I know nothing about. What do we do? Grace asked. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression made her stomach tighten with a fear that had nothing to do with Marcus at all. We do nothing, he said. You do nothing. This is not your problem to solve. It became my problem the moment I told you what I heard, Grace said. I'm not asking you to let me come to the docks tonight. I'm asking you not to shut me out of something I'm already part of. Adrian's jaw worked, the argument visible on his face even before he spoke it out loud. If something happens to you because of what you have learned in this building, he said, I will not be able to live with that. Do you understand what kind of men deal in unscheduled shipments at midnight? This is not a meeting with careful businessmen worried about timelines. This is the part of my world I have tried, since the day you walked through that side door, to keep away from you. I'm already in it, Grace said quietly. You can't protect me from something I'm already standing inside of. Neither of them had a good answer for that, and the argument settled, unresolved, into the tense silence of the rest of the afternoon. Adrian made it clear, in the end, that Grace would stay at the office, away from the docks, away from whatever was going to happen that night. Grace agreed, mostly because she understood there was no version of the conversation where arguing further would change his mind, and partly because some quiet, sensible part of her recognized that he was right to be afraid for her. She spent the evening alone in the office, the building emptying out around her 1 floor at a time, until even the cleaning crew had finished and gone, leaving her with nothing but the hum of the air system and the slow, steady creep of the clock toward midnight. She tried to read through paperwork that needed translating for a meeting that suddenly felt very far away and unimportant. She tried calling Holly, then thought better of it, not wanting to explain the particular flavor of fear sitting in her chest that night. Mostly, she simply sat by the window, watching the harbor lights, and waited. By 10 o'clock, the waiting had become unbearable. She told herself, over and over, that Adrian had men trained for exactly this kind of work, that her presence at the dock would help nothing, and might easily make everything worse. She told herself this all the way up until the moment she found herself pulling on her coat, already reaching for her phone to call a car, some quieter and more honest part of her recognizing that she had never actually intended to stay behind. Not really. Not since the moment she had heard Marcus's voice through that thin office wall, and understood how far this had already gone. She did not stay away. It was nearly 11 that night when Grace found herself in the back seat of a car she had called herself, giving an address 2 blocks from the South Dock, her hands cold despite the warm evening air. She told herself she was simply going to watch from a distance, to be nearby in case something went wrong, in case Adrian needed someone who could move quickly and quietly, without drawing the kind of attention his own men might draw. She told herself this was reasonable. She did not entirely believe it, even as she said it to herself. The dock, when she arrived, was mostly dark, lit only by the scattered glow of security lights too far apart to do their job properly. Grace kept to the shadows near a row of stacked containers, watching as Adrian's car pulled in along with two others, his men spreading out quietly across the open space. She could see Adrian himself, tense and alert, moving toward a smaller building near the water where a single light burned in an upstairs window. She should have stayed where she was. Later she would tell herself this over and over, the way people do after a decision has already been made and cannot be unmade. But she saw movement near the containers closest to her, a shape that did not belong to any of Adrian's men, slipping quietly toward the building Adrian was walking into, and something in her would not let her simply watch and say nothing. "Adrian," she called out, her voice carrying further than she meant it to in the open quiet of the dock. "Behind you." Everything happened very quickly after that. The shape near the containers turned out to be one of Marcus's men, and the warning gave Adrian just enough time to turn before the man closed the distance between them, the two of them grappling briefly in the dim light, before Adrian's own men reached them and pulled the stranger away, restrained and furious, shouting something in a language Grace didn't immediately recognize. But the warning had also given away her own position, and within seconds, a second figure emerged from the shadows near where she stood, moving toward her with a speed that left no time to think, only to react. Grace turned to run, her feet finding the uneven ground badly in the dark, and felt a hand close around her arm before she had gone more than a few steps. She didn't scream. She would think about that detail later too, the strange, instinctive silence that had taken over instead of panic, some old, buried part of her brain deciding that quiet and careful was safer than loud and desperate. She twisted hard against the grip on her arm, throwing her weight backward in a way that surprised the man holding her just long enough to loosen his hold, and she broke free, stumbling toward the nearest stack of containers, putting solid metal between herself and whoever was behind her. "Grace!" Adrian's voice cut across the dock, sharp with a fear that matched her own, and within seconds he was there, placing himself between her and the man who had grabbed her, his own men closing in from every direction until the man had nowhere left to go and simply stopped, hands raised, understanding the math of the situation as clearly as anyone. It was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Marcus's two men were restrained, the unscheduled shipment exposed for what it was, a side operation Marcus had been running for months, skimming product through Adrian's own docks under a name that wasn't his, using a network he had built quietly over years of being trusted with exactly this kind of access. Daniel Cross, it became clear in the hour that followed, had discovered the operation weeks before his disappearance, and had likely confronted Marcus about it, or threatened to bring it to Adrian directly. Marcus himself was not at the dock that night. He was, Adrian's men quickly discovered, already on his way out of the city, his car caught on a traffic camera heading toward the airport less than 20 minutes after his men had failed to report back. Adrian made one phone call, his voice flat and final, and Grace understood, without needing the details explained to her, that wherever Marcus thought he was going, he would not get there. "You could have been killed," Adrian said to her, once the dock had quieted, once his men had finished their work and the night had settled back into something resembling stillness. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual control, and his hands, when he reached for her shoulders, were not entirely steady. "I told you to stay away from this." "I know," Grace said. "Why didn't you listen?" "Because I saw someone moving toward you, and I couldn't just stand there and watch," Grace said, her own voice shaking now that the danger had passed and her body had caught up with everything her mind had pushed through a few minutes before. "I'm sorry. I know it was reckless. I would do it again." Adrian looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving across his face, and then, without either of them quite deciding to, the distance between them closed, his arms coming around her in a way that had nothing to do with business or translation, or the careful professional line they had both tried, with varying success, to maintain. "You are not allowed to do that again," he said quietly, his voice muffled against her hair. "I mean it. I'll try," Grace said, which was, she understood, the most honest promise she could offer him. They stood there for a long moment, the harbor quiet around them, the danger of the night finally beginning to settle into something they could both, eventually, set down. Whatever else was still unresolved, whatever still waited for them in the days ahead with Marcus gone and a deal with Edward Lang still hanging in the balance, this particular threat had passed, and they had passed through it together, neither of them entirely unchanged by it. Grace thought, standing there in the cool night air with Adrian's arms still around her, of Daniel Cross, and hoped, with a sadness she hadn't expected to feel for a man she had never met, that somewhere in the answers still left to uncover, there would be enough truth to give him whatever peace the truth could offer. She thought, too, of her grandmother, and the careful, stubborn insistence on a language Grace had once resented learning, and understood now, more clearly than she ever had before, exactly what that gift had brought her to. It was not over, not entirely, but for the first time in weeks, Grace felt the quiet, solid sense that whatever came next, she would not be facing it from outside the world she had stumbled into. She was, for better or worse, already standing in the middle of it, and she did not, despite everything, wish herself anywhere else. The days after the dock settled into a strange, careful quiet, the kind that follows any storm large enough to change the shape of everything around it. Marcus Doyle did not return to the office, and within a week, his name had been quietly removed from every account, every contract, every piece of paperwork that had once carried his signature alongside Adrian's. No one in the building spoke about where he had gone. Grace did not ask. Some questions she had learned by now were better left where they were. What mattered more, in the days that followed, was the truth about Daniel Cross. It came together slowly, through documents Adrian's men recovered from the operation Marcus had been running, through a storage unit registered under a name that traced back, after careful searching, to an address 2 states away. Daniel had not disappeared the way Grace had feared in her worst, quiet moments lying awake at night. He had run, frightened and certain that staying meant becoming the next entry in a ledger he had never been meant to see, after confronting Marcus about the shipments he had discovered moving quietly through docks that weren't supposed to exist. Adrian found him eventually, 3 weeks after the night at the South Dock, living under a different name in a small apartment, far enough from the city that he had believed himself forgotten. The conversation between them, when it finally happened, was not one Grace was present for, and Adrian never gave her the full details of what was said, but he came back from it quieter than usual, and later that evening, sitting across from her in the small restaurant that had become, without either of them quite deciding it, their place, he told her enough. "He thought I sent Marcus after him," Adrian said. "He thought I knew. All this time he believed I was the one who wanted him gone, and he ran rather than face what he thought I had become." "Did you tell him the truth?" Grace asked. "I told him everything," Adrian said. "I don't know if it changed what he believes about me, but he knows now, at least, that I spent 6 weeks searching for him because I thought something terrible had happened, not because I wanted it to. Will he come back?" Adrian shook his head slowly. "I don't think so, and I don't think I would ask him to, even if he wanted to. Some things, once they're broken, don't go back to exactly what they were before." He looked at her then, something steady and certain in his expression. "I have someone else now, someone who didn't simply translate my words, but understood what they were supposed to mean, even when I couldn't find the right way to say it myself." Grace felt something warm settle in her chest, equal parts pride and something far less professional, something she had stopped trying to talk herself out of weeks ago. The deal with Edward Lang closed 2 weeks later, in a final meeting that went more smoothly than any of the ones before it. Grace sat at Adrian's side, translating with the same careful balance of accuracy and instinct she had learned, almost by accident, that very first afternoon, when she had walked into his office with the wrong delivery and no idea what she was walking into. Edward shook both their hands at the end of it, his expression genuinely pleased for the first time since the negotiations had begun. "Glad this finally came together," Edward said. "You two make a good team." "We do," Adrian said, and Grace, translating nothing at all in that moment, simply smiled and let the words stand exactly as they were. Afterward, once the room had emptied, and the harbor outside the windows had settled into its evening colors, Adrian turned to her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something almost hesitant beneath the usual calm. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what happens now. The deal is finished. You no longer need to stay involved in any of this, if you don't want to." Grace considered the question honestly, weighing it the way she had weighed every decision since that first strange knock at his door. She thought of the apartment with the faucet she had finally fixed, the delivery job she had quietly given notice on 2 weeks earlier, without quite telling herself why. The grandmother whose stubborn insistence on a language Grace had once resented had, in the end, opened a door she never could have predicted walking through. "I don't want to stop," she said. "Not because of the money, though I won't pretend that doesn't matter. I want to stay because somewhere in the middle of all of this, I stopped thinking of it as just a job. Adrian's expression shifted, something unguarded breaking through the careful composure he wore so easily in every other room of his life. I was hoping you would say that, he said, though I admit I was not entirely certain how to ask the question I actually wanted to ask. Which question is that? Grace asked, though she suspected, from the way he was looking at her, that she already knew. Whether you would consider staying for reasons that have nothing to do with translation at all, Adrian said. Grace laughed, a real laugh this time, the careful distance of the past several weeks finally giving way to something simpler and far more honest. I think, she said, that question answered itself a while ago. Outside the window, the city moved through its ordinary evening, indifferent to the quiet, significant moment passing in the room above it, the same city that had sent Grace to the wrong floor on an unremarkable Tuesday night, carrying a bag of orange chicken that had gone cold by the time anyone got around to eating it. She thought, looking back on it now, that she would never quite be able to explain to anyone outside this strange new life of hers how something as small as a wrong address had managed to rearrange everything she thought she understood about where her own story was supposed to go. In the months that followed, the business Adrian ran continued forward on steadier ground than it had stood on in years, free of the quiet corruption that had been working against it from the inside without anyone fully realizing how deep it ran. Grace's role grew alongside it, no longer simply the woman who translated his words, but a steady, trusted presence beside him in nearly every important room he entered. She kept her grandmother's photograph on her desk, a small, quiet reminder of exactly where the gift that had changed her life had first come from, and she made a point, every few weeks, of calling to tell her about it, though she left out the parts that would have worried her grandmother far more than they amused her. Daniel Cross never returned to the city, but he sent a letter eventually, brief and careful, thanking Adrian for the truth and wishing him well, signed with nothing more than his name and no return address. Adrian kept it in the same drawer where he had once kept a folder with a single damning word written in someone else's handwriting, though now it sat there for entirely different reasons, a small, private reminder of how close everything had come to falling apart, and how unexpectedly it had instead come together. A year passed before either of them spoke openly about how much had changed since that first wrong delivery. It happened, fittingly enough, in the same small restaurant where Adrian had once told her she reminded him of someone, the two of them marking the anniversary of the closed deal with Edward Lang, in a quiet, private kind of celebration neither of them had planned in advance. "Holly still asks about you," Grace said, smiling over her glass. "She thinks I made you up the first few months. A mysterious shipping executive who needed a delivery girl's grandmother's Russian. She said it sounded like something out of a movie." "What do you tell her now?" Adrian asked. "That the movie version left out most of the paperwork," Grace said, and Adrian laughed, a real laugh, easy and unguarded in a way that still, after a year, surprised her every time it happened. He grew quieter after that, turning his glass slowly between his fingers, and Grace recognized the particular stillness that came over him whenever he was working up to something he had not yet found the right words for, the same stillness she had first learned to read across a conference table full of careful business language. "I have built a great deal in this country," he said finally. "Money. A company that survived things that should have ended it, but I spent most of those years certain that none of it would ever feel like enough to make up for everything I left behind to get here." He looked at her, steady and direct. "Then a woman knocked on the wrong door with the wrong order, and somehow made all of it feel like it had been worth something after all." Grace reached across the table and took his hand, the gesture simple and certain, carrying none of the careful translation either of them had once relied on to say exactly what they meant. "I never thought a wrong address would turn into the best mistake of my life," she said. "Then we are agreed," Adrian said. "It was a very good mistake." Grace thought, sometimes, about the version of that night that might have happened if she had simply delivered the food to the correct floor and gone on with her ordinary evening, never knocking on the wrong door, never hearing a man's voice slip between two languages he couldn't quite hold together on his own. She did not spend much time wondering what that life would have looked like. She had, in the end, very little interest in finding out. What she knew instead, standing beside Adrian one evening as the harbor lights came on across the water, was simpler and far more certain than anything she could have predicted on that first strange night. She had walked into the wrong building, carrying the wrong order, and somehow found, in all of it, exactly the right place to be.